Black ash fell from the sky as a cottage burned. A very young boy screamed for his parents as they were forcibly dragged up the gallows steps in chains. The young boy beat his tiny fists against the power-armored guard that crushed him against their chest. The boy's shrieks echoed down the street as the high priest slipped the coarse nooses around his parents' necks. The high priest raised an arm to call for silence, opulent robe glittering in the light from the burning cottage. A gauntlet covered the boy's mouth, suppressing his screams as the high priest spoke with a haughty, superior tone. "For the crime of slander against the monarchy, these parasites are sentenced to death. As high priest and lord of this town, I shall serve as their executioner." The high priest's clawed hand curled around the lever, and with a sick grin growing on his scaled, diamond-shaped face, yanked it down. The ropes went taut, and two souls made their final journey home. Drake stood, boot soaked in blood, as he glared daggers at the high priest, who looked to have been caught completely off guard by the sudden brutality. Shock turned to fear as the high priest turned, shouting as he took off in the opposite direction. "Sound the alarm! Enemy at the town square!" Drake let go of the limp forearm he'd been holding onto with a snarl. Red clouded his vision, the screaming in his ears unrelenting as he broke into a sprint, chasing the high priest. Even in robes, the high priest could run, but he still barely outpaced the rage-fueled beast on his tail. A small squad of guards burst from a building, and the high priest ran towards them, pausing only to wildly gesture at the charging, sword-wielding human before continuing to run. Screams rose from behind him. Drake swept his sword upwards as he met the first guard at full tilt. The guard reeled back, screaming and clutching at the gushing stump where their arm used to be. The next three hardly took him much longer, as he leapt forward into a headbutt, aimed at the middle Geknosion. He felt their weaker bones shattering against his forehead as stars burst in front of his eyes, but he barely stumbled as he kept running, quickly regaining ground on the fleeing high priest. He ran with a single-minded determination, with a singular goal, to kill that goddamned high priest. The high priest rounded a bend in the street, bursting through a small wooden gate and coming to a stop as he tried to catch his breath, a wicked grin coming to his face as he could no longer contain his glee. He straightened as he heard that violent parasite burst through the gate and freeze. The high priest raised his arms in a grand, sweeping gesture to indicate the hundreds of town guards with Gauss rifles brought to bear on the blade-wielding ape. A few dozen soldiers decked out in power armor clomped towards the human as the high priest laughed with joy. "Oh, you foolish boy. I don't know how you escaped the arena, but you won't escape me. Though before I have my men kill you, who are you to single me out?" Drake stared at the high priest, rage and indignation twisting his face into a sneer as he shouted back, "You killed my parents!" He breathed heavily, sword gripped so tightly his knuckles turned white. Drake burned with rage as the high priest gave him a quizzical look. "Do you have the slightest idea how little that narrows it down? No, well, I tire of this charade. Who in Rut's name are you?" The high priest glared at something behind Drake, and Drake couldn't help but see for himself. A little, hunched-back old man in a tattered beggar's cloth leaned on a gnarled old staff as he shuffled a few steps forward. Then, lifting the staff, placing it down a few inches ahead, before shuffling forward again. A long, gray beard, with twin braids loomed into it, adorned the old man's wrinkled, kindly face. Drake felt his rage cool as he looked at the man with sympathy, softly saying, "You don't want to be here, sir. I don't want you getting caught up in my mistakes." The high priest snarled at this and shouted, "Answer me, you parasite, before I have you both shot!" The old man slowly lifted his bald head, revealing a set of surprisingly sharp and clear chocolate-colored eyes. Coughing and clearing his throat, the old man leaned heavily on his staff as he finally responded, his voice touched by the signature rasp of old age. "My name is Cassius. I am not but an old beggar. However, I remember what it was like to be free, to live without the oppressive thumb of tyranny ever pressing on your back. I wish to feel that freedom again, even if it is only for the moment before I pass." The old man lifted his gaze to the high priest, cracking his own wicked grin that sent shivers down Drake's spine. "So I pulled some old toys of mine out of storage to tip the scales in this young man's favor." The old man's walking stick clattered to the ground as his arms reached into the cloak, the old man's back straightening out as he began to laugh. Drake felt an overwhelming sense of dread and dropped to the floor. The high priest, sensing the same danger, dove out of the way as the old man's tattered rags were shredded. The old man cackled maniacally as the two arms, that were now obviously artificial, brandished a pair of GX-50 handguns. The old man's real arms racked the charging handle on a claquette belt-fed machine gun, belt of ammunition swaying as the old man brought it to bear on the surprised Geknosions. Cackling his challenge, the old man opened fire. "Come get a piece, you greedy sons of bitches!" Gunfire roared, ferrous steel and soft lead flying every direction, as the high priest desperately crawled away from the slaughter, watching as his men fell to the ground with chunks taken out of them. The high priest scrambled past two charging guards as they were cut down. Spotting an open door, the high priest leapt inside, kicking the door shut with a sigh of relief as he was plunged into darkness. He briefly wondered where and how that old parasite had hidden such heavy weaponry and augmentations. The high priest screamed in shock and pain as the sword blade was slammed tip first into his leg, pinning him to the floor. Drake breathed laboredly, cheek torn open where a Gauss slug had almost taken his head off. Drake giggled maliciously as he unshouldered his pack. "All that running, and yet here you sit, at my mercy." Drake mockingly imitated the high priest's grand way of speaking as he reached under his pack's flap and pulled out a long length of stout rope he had retrieved from the arena. "Your death shall serve as a message to the others. Be grateful that you won't be forgotten, parasite." The high priest watched in horror as the door opened, and instead of his men, that four-armed parasite grinned at them. Why me?" he whimpered. "You know why." Drake responded simply, looping the noose around the high priest's neck before making sure it was snug. The town square watched as their tormentor was slowly hauled off the ground by their neck. The high priest jerked and squirmed as Drake heaved him higher and higher on the tree that so many helpless humans had swung from. Then, tying the end of the rope to a metal loop sticking from the cobbles, he straightened, staring out at the eyes of his fellow slaves. They did not return to look, their eyes fixed on the still struggling high priest. Then a man, missing one hand, knelt down and retrieved a loose stone. Then, winding back, threw it at the struggling high priest. Like a switch had been flipped. Rocks, rotten food, insults, and even a few Gauss slugs were hurled at the slowly succumbing high priest. Drake looked on, a feeling rising in his chest, one he had never felt before. Utter satisfaction.